Colson Whitehead, and Jon Meacham.
Thank you. Thank you all. There's an old Ronald Reagan saying when he was in Hollywood, he would be asked to come to various dinners, charity dinners, and he would say, "But I can't sing or dance. Why would you want me?" And they said, "Well, no, you can't, but you can introduce someone who can." So that's my job, to talk to Colson about his remarkable novel and body of work about the great cataclysm in American life. Shelby Foote called the Civil War the crossroads of our being, and we still, I think we see every day the continuing echoes of the great cataclysm of the 1860s. But I want to start 10 years or 11 years before Fort Sumter. Give us a portrait, a snapshot of America in 1850.
Well, first, thanks for having me, and all you nice folks for coming out. And it's nice to meet you. In the morning, I get up and I'm like, "Can I look at the news?" No, I can't. Can I look at the news? And I turn on the news, like, damn it. But
There's no reason.
But then it's always nice to see your reasonable face on MSNBC. So
being a reasonable pundit these days is like being the best restaurant in a hospital.
Yeah. So
Not that hard to do, right. But thank you.
Right. So, my book takes place before the Civil War. I don't actually name the year it takes place in the book. It has to take place after 1848 because the fugitive slave law is in effect. And if you don't, just to refresh, you could have been run away from the South, a slave, made a new life in New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts. And then the fugitive slave law goes into effect, and slave catchers, your master, could come back and bring you back down to the South. You're still property, even if you're in the North, in a free state, even if you start a new life. And of course, that changes the dynamics of slavery and and helps precipitate the Civil War in different ways. And so my heroine is named Cora. She's a 17-year-old girl. She's on a plantation in Georgia. And a new slave comes to the plantation, has word of the Underground Railroad, and convinces her to take off. And she is first reluctant. She's alone on the plantation. Her mother has run off years before. She's a bit of an outcast. She's defiant, kind of a misfit, but then has to take this leap of faith that there is a safe place out of Georgia, out of the South, and into the North. And that's where we begin.
So your So 1850, there's the Great Compromise, Henry Clay pulled together, and that's back when senators from Kentucky brought things together. But the question is, for the country, was the Republican Party emerges as a moral force, really the first party to have, of the 4 to 5 parties in American history at that point, to have clearly a moral dimension. But it was anti-slavery, not necessarily abolition. And that's an important distinction. Can you talk about what was the feelings, the thoughts, the different categories in that tumultuous decade?
Well, slavery is economic power, and that's power in general. You can't really take human slavery, chattel slavery out of the equation of capitalism. It helps make America into a much bigger power. It helps America step onto the world stage. And so we have new states coming into the Union. Are they going to be part of slavery? Are they part of a different sort of American idea, an idea we have for ourselves? My book sort of plays a lot with different periods of American history, moves them around. And so we start off in 1850 and then head off into a fantasy land where we have events from the 1890s coming into Cora's world. We have events from the mid-20th century, the 1960s coming in and changing Cora's equation with her journey. And so, as a historian, you have to get it right. As a fiction writer, I can make things up and move things around.
That's the damn. I was misinformed about that.
Yeah.
It's like Claude Rains in Casablanca. It's like,
I guess
sand here.
I've written books that are realistic and do stick to the truth. And I've written books that have elements of fantasy. And I think you picked the right tool for the job. I'm lucky that I don't have to get it right. And when I was writing this book, I was thinking that I wouldn't stick to the facts, but I would stick to the truth, a sort of greater American truth, by moving different things around. And so, I think we both come to 1850 from a different perspective. We have different demands upon our work. I have, given talks where people say, it's usually a nice gentleman in the audience who probably reads giant 2,000-page Robert Caro books about a certain person and says, aren't you worried in this age of fake news about moving things around? Aren't you afraid that people might get the wrong idea about history and what actually happened? And I say, no. I think the Underground Railroad, a novel, pretty much says that we're entering into a fantastic place. The Underground Railroad, of course, was not a real Underground Railroad. In my book, it is. It's a subway beneath the earth, which is very impractical. And so I assume that when you see that on the jacket copy, that we are in a place that is not necessarily bound by what actually happened, but what could have been. By moving things around. As a fiction writer, I have that latitude to take what actually happened and hopefully get a different kind of history going.
Right. I just want to say that gentleman who stands up, who reads those books, is, in my vernacular, the base.
Sure.
So we want to keep that.
Yeah.
Let's not be dismissive of the 2,000-page guys.
It's
Mr. MacArthur genius.
It's what we expect. It's what we expect from when we pick up a book. Are we going to stick to the facts, or can we have that play with fiction?
Right. Well, not all of us are geniuses, so we have to do what we can. So give us some break.
Well, give me some pointers.
Well, yeah, you need them clearly. I'm sorry things haven't worked out for you. Barbara Tuchman, the great historian, used to say that people will go along with you in nonfiction if you don't give away the ending. That even though they know how it turned out, August 1914 wasn't a great month. But if you treat history, if you treat nonfiction as a novel where you don't give away the ending, that there is a kind of Coleridgean suspension of disbelief that people will give you. And I find that to be reassuring to a large extent. But do people really come after you for I would think it's very clear that you're an imaginative artist and you're dealing with history in a way that, Robert Penn Warren, people used to joke that Robert Penn Warren's best biography was about Willie Stark, of course, who didn't exist. People think that Huey Long was Warren's protagonist in All the King's Men, but I think there's a rich tradition of using novels, as you say, to get to the truth, not necessarily the facts.
Well, I think when it comes to something like slavery, which in a lot of different different states have different ideas of how to teach different moments in American history, whether it's dispossession of Native Americans or slavery. Definitely, when I was growing up, we skipped over some of the terrible parts. I think in maybe fourth grade we had 10 minutes on slavery and then 40 minutes on Abraham Lincoln, and then we can move on. In high school, 10 minutes on segregation, and then 40 minutes on Martin Luther King, and then we can move on. And so we know how things end up. We don't always know, but there's also this sense that things aren't necessarily laid out. But basically, what I'm saying is that because slavery is so poorly taught, we don't want to think about it. We'd like to skip to the good parts that people want a document from my book, and I don't provide that because I am making things up. And there is that gap in our knowledge about how slaves were treated, how the economy of slavery actually worked, that we don't want to contemplate. You know, I'll get asked, did you exaggerate some of the violence in the book? And, you know, how do you keep 4 million people in bondage? You don't use harsh language. You use torture, dehumanization, there's sexual assault. If someone runs away, how do you keep the 100 other slaves from running away? You cut off their feet. And I'll get asked, like, did that really happen? And yes, that is, that's an economic decision. You lose one slave's labor, but you keep 100 other people in bondage. And so I think because slavery isn't deeply taught, because it is a very difficult and uncomfortable subject, people come to the book with different ideas about what's real and what's fake and what's expected of me as a fiction writer as opposed to what's expected of a historian.
Yeah. How do you sort out, because many of the station masters, if you will, on the Underground Railroad were whites. How do you sort out the role of particular people from the dominant class in the story, particularly from your period from 1850 forward? I mean, as you know, when Andrew Jackson was president, the most radical position on American slavery, the most progressive position really, was recolonization. There wasn't the idea that there was an Emancipation Proclamation just waiting to be signed is ahistorical. And in fact, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was a military document that freed slaves in the states that had seceded, not in the border states, because he was afraid of losing the border states. So even the great heroic moment of the drama, in many ways, is not as heroic as we sometimes think. But how do you judge Lincoln? What's your view?
Like all of us, complicated. You know, and I think nobody is particularly pure. You know, I think we all have our weaknesses, our strengths, and it's my job to present the heroes and the villains in my story as three-dimensional human beings. And so there's a very villainous slave catcher in my book named Ridgway. He has a lot of page time. He has to be three-dimensional. And so that means, even though he is wretched and despicable, he has to be somehow recognizable as a human being. It's not a case where you have evil white people, super virtuous whites in the North. Each slave is virtuous. Each free black person is virtuous. We're all, you know, human beings. And so people have been surprised that Ridgway, the slave catcher, does have this sort of human element, and that's my job as a fiction writer, to create three-dimensional people. People are surprised that in the slave quarter, some of the slaves are not the sort of virtuous people we get in pop culture. I think in pop culture, this image of the plantation where there's maybe one Uncle Tom and everyone else in the plantation, is working together. That's not true from my experience. I think if you have 100 people in a room, 10 are great, 10 are terrible, and most of us sort of vacillate. If you have 100 people on a plantation, slaves, who have been dehumanized, brutalized, we're not going to be on our best behavior. We're not going to attain our higher selves. If you read the literature of concentration camps, everyone's fighting for survival, and you know, there are cases where you're in this terrible situation, you get out, and you can't look at the person who you've been sort of caged up with for a year because you both remind each other of that humiliation. And so my portrait of a plantation hopefully has, in a slave quarter, three-dimensional people who are virtuous and also not virtuous, and also with slave masters and slave catchers, they're recognizable in their villainy and also in their recognizable human moments too.
What was your source material? Because you didn't just make it all up.
No, I mean, I don't like to leave the house. So luckily, a lot of the primary sources I used are in the public domain. I went back and read slave narratives I read in college that stayed with me. There's a woman named Harriet Jacobs who wrote a famous slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and she writes very movingly about how when a slave girl becomes a slave woman, she enters into a new, more terrible form of slavery. You're now subject to your master's desires if you weren't already. You're supposed to pump out babies because babies are property. It's more money for your master. And so it was important to go back to her story, and she was part of the reason I picked a female protagonist. In the 1930s, the US government, Great Depression, hired writers to interview former slaves and get their life stories. It seems crazy that the government would try to keep writers employed, but it was the Great Depression, and
How things have changed.
and they did it. And so, there's thousands of accounts, and some are 2 paragraphs, some are 20 pages, some are about plantation life, some are about master-slave relations. And for a fiction writer, there's a lot of stuff that wouldn't fit into a history book. The nouns and verbs and adjectives that they use, the way to describe violence. If you are brutalized every day, you see these atrocities, and you're telling the story, you don't have to dramatize them or gussy them up to win over the reader. They speak for themselves. And so I borrowed that sort of matter-of-fact language of brutality in the book. There are a few histories of the Underground Railroad, not as many as you'd think. There's one called Bound for Canaan by Fergus Bordewich, which came out 10 years ago. Eric Foner came out with Gateway to Freedom when I was writing the book, and that was very important. I usually write about New York. I like writing about New York, and I was very depressed that I couldn't get New York into this book. And then I read Eric Foner's book, which has really great stuff on the sort of war between abolitionist lawyers and slave catchers in New York, the sort of legal strategies they would use to one-up each other. And so, as a fiction writer, I'm trying to figure out what fits in, what doesn't. Ridgway, the slave catcher, comes to New York and becomes sort of who he is in the book, and I use the Eric Foner section as a way to get in. And I was like, finally, I can get New York into my book. I'm really happy.
Eric is, for those of you who don't know his work, it's amazing. Eric's one of those very annoying people who's really, really smart and really, really nice, and it just really pisses me off. Sure. I mean, it's just, yeah. He can't write a bad sentence, which is really annoying, but a great man. What were were there novels, historical novels along the way that were an inspiration? Did you have any? Was there any music in the back of your head?
Not so much historical novels. I mean, obviously, Toni Morrison's Beloved is a big touchstone, and Roots. I think a lot of people in my generation, our first exposure to slavery is watching Roots on television. Our parents would make all his kids watch with them, and obviously it was a national phenomenon, and then this book's been published a lot abroad, and it was the same sort of national event in different countries. Everyone crowded around. And for a lot of people, that's our first introduction to slavery. In terms of novels, the fantastic elements, I think, owes a bit of debt to Garcia Marquez. I read 100 Years of Solitude when I was younger, and reread it before I wrote this book, and it seemed that his blend of magical realism would be very instructive. The book, each state that Cora goes through is a different state of American possibilities, sort of like Gulliver's Travels. And it seemed if I presented the fantastic elements with a straight face, the way that Garcia Marquez does, it would serve the book. I read an interview with him where he said that he came up with his blend of magic realism from his grandmother's stories. She would tell a story about growing up in her village and mix and say, for example, the deputy grew wings and flew off, and he could never tell what was real and what was fake, and that became his sort of brand of fantasy. And it seemed that blend of telling fantastic elements with a straight face, in the same way that I sort of use I tell the violent episodes with a straight face would serve the story. And so, as I go along, different books draw from different inspirations, and definitely Garcia Marquez and Toni Morrison were important for this book.
Yeah. So, part of the perhaps unsought mission of the artist is to bear some witness to the reality of the time as well as to the reality of the imaginative context that you create in the novel. When you look around, you mentioned the news, over the past 18 months, 2 years, what do you see that feels too close to the imaginative universe you created, and are there moments that give you hope?
Give me hope. It's a bit, a bit harder. I think
you get extra credit for that.
Sure. And I'll answer the hard part first, and then try to keep that in my mind. When the book came out, it came out in August of 16, and so people kept saying, "Were you thinking of Ferguson and Black Lives Matter when you were writing the book?" And that seemed very separate. Obviously, there's a new conversation about police brutality started by Black Lives Matter. But for me, it's nothing new. I mean, I think there are high-profile police brutality cases. We start talking about them, and then we stop. And then something else happens, and we start again. And that's been the feature as a black person in America, this periodic conversation that trails off. And so Ferguson perhaps opened some people's eyes, but obviously being stopped by police, stopped and frisked, it wasn't anything new to me. And then we elect Donald Trump, and we have a white supremacist president for the first time in a while. And this book is about white supremacy and capitalism, and how our nation was formed in different ways by these different energies. And so the conversation about the book changed because a lot of the things in the book are now relevant again. All those sort of secret forces are back into play and altering legislation, people's lives in a way that they were not, say, in the summer of 2016. And it's changed my relationship to the book. White supremacy did seem very remote when I was writing it, and I could never envision that we'd have such a renewed conversation about it, but here we are. So I think you write a book, as you know, and then the context of when it actually is published a year and a half later is much different than how you would think about it when you're writing it.
I mean, it is remarkable because this is a novel you undertook when Barack Obama was president, and you publish it in the season where Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, and it's being read most widely while he's becoming president. So how did you arrange that publicity rollout exactly?
No, I mean, we were talking about,
because that's good, man.
Well, it's my 8th book, and sometimes you write a book and no one cares.
Right.
And then you write a book, and then it strikes a chord with people, and you can't kind of like that.
I mean, is it true you were in Charlottesville? Just kidding.
Well, because I've been traveling for the book in different countries, and so whatever's happening that week becomes the main question. And so I was in Denmark in August. And people say, "Oh, your book's great." Anyway, so what happened?
Right.
KKK, what's up with that?
Right.
And so, I mean, you never know. I guess we were talking, before you came out here about books we're working on now and how the times change what you're working on. And before the election, I was like, I wrote a very depressing book about slavery. I'm going to write a crime novel. It's going to have some jokes. Right. I usually do a comic novel, depressing novel, comic novel, oppressing my different parts of my personality. And then after the election, I was like, I guess another depressing book about institutional racism in America seems more pertinent. And you were talking about how you're maybe changing the focus of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard because there's no longer process than writing a book. I guess making a movie would be the one. It's like an elephant giving birth. It just takes a long time. Although that's actually more useful in the end. But to me, one of the interesting moments, one of the interesting facts of the current climate, and your presence here suggests that your hearts and minds are in the more considered realm. But we do live in a technological universe where we have the means to express opinions rapidly, even if we don't have opinions worth expressing rapidly, right? I mean, that's fundamentally the problem. It's like sitting in a bar. It's like, if Andy Capp had a big crowd in his bar every time. And I think that to my mind, the great refuge, the great strength of a book is you can take some time to think about it. And they're never really, I don't know about if you think this, I don't think mine are ever really done. Now I'm a biographer, so it's the idea that you would have the final word on someone's life is the height of hubris. You never can. But do your characters still live in your head right now? Have they gone beyond the confines of the book in your head?
It's changed. I mean, I think my first couple novels, I started with a very intellectual premise and tried to figure it out. And I think my first book that was really personal, Sag Harbor, was about growing up in the 80s and was autobiographical. And that was the first time I thought, maybe like a sequel, I can have this teenage kid 10 years later, who is he? And
Southampton.
He's a writer.
He's a writer.
I wrote a zombie apocalypse novel. I like to mix it up. And I like that world, and so maybe, and after 6 months I was done with that. I didn't feel that way. But with this book, I felt very proud of the last 30 pages. I think, they're the best thing I've done so far. And I was done with Cora's story. She ends up where I think she should end up, but I would go back in this sort of semi-creepy way and reread the last 100 pages and think, okay, I think I did a good job. How can I take what I've learned here into the next book? I think I'm hopefully still growing as a writer, and there are things I learned in my zombie book or my personal book, my autobiographical book, that helped with the creation of Cora and a lot of the narrative style in this book. And so what can I learn from what I pulled off in this book that can help me with the next book?
So you reread your stuff?
I would say no, but I did go back to this book a little bit more than I usually do.
Yeah,
usually do.
I can never open anything again because I would start to change it, and it would just remind me of all the things I didn't get quite right.
Well, I think the older the book is, the more I'm like, oh, I should have been 50 pages shorter.
Everything can be 50 pages shorter.
There's so many adjectives in that book. Why I like so many adjectives in The Intuitionist? It was really weird.
Right.
So it's good policy, I think, not to go back.
Right. Let's talk about zombie apocalypses. So, how likely do you think we are? How close are we?
Exactly. Well, I think if you go to Whole Foods at 6 p.m., you can see a lot of zombies. People are shuffling.
There's the Senate at midnight.
Sure. I mean, I think I think the zombie metaphor is popular because it does speak to, I think, the way we perceive people. For me,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Give us, because there was in the last 7 years kind of a zombie moment. 8 years, right? There was The Walking Dead. There were a number of novels. So put your sociological hat on. What was it about 2010 that led us to a zombie moment?
Well, we have 30 years of zombie narratives: Night of the Living Dead, George Romero, Dawn of the Dead, and for me, I was a big consumer of horror and science fiction, and I had very permissive parents who would let me see very gory movies at an early age, and for decades, I would have a zombie anxiety dream every month. Sometimes they're fast, sometimes they're slow, sometimes they get me, sometimes they don't, and I try to identify, with the help of a good therapist, why it stayed with me. And for me, it was like for me, what makes the zombie scary is a zombie is a person who stopped pretending. You go to bed, the next day you wake up, your loved ones, your neighbors have become the monsters they've always been. They look the same, but now they're out to kill you, like they've always been out to kill you. And if you read,
do we have some trust issues?
And and the first big zombie movie is Night of the Living Dead. The hero is a black protagonist being chased by mobs of white people who want to devour him, and that's sort of American history. And so, in terms of what it means for different people, for me, it's a socialization problem that goes back to my childhood somewhere.
Okay. That was maybe more revealing than I was hoping.
Well, these people pay good money. I want to,
Yeah.
make them feel that they
Yeah.
know me.
Usually when Colson does this, it's a 50-minute hour.
50, where do you go?
As a WASP, we just start to drink after 50 minutes. It's like, I think you need more olives. Okay. Always a good thing. So talk about your process. You think a depressing novel coming up will be more in tune with the zeitgeist. I suspect your bet is right there. But does the next idea come to you when you're getting a cup of coffee? Or do you sit down and think, I'm now going to think of a big idea, and it descends? How does it happen?
It varies. I'm just talking about the zombie novel. I had some house guests out in the country, and I was going through a terrible time, and I was getting divorced, or I suspected. My wife got a divorce lawyer, so that was sort of a hint. And then
I'm a nonfiction guy, but I think that's a sign.
As a tell. And
Yeah.
so, but we were still hanging out, and we had house guests, and I woke up one morning, and I heard my guests downstairs, and I was like, I don't want to see them. I'm just going to will myself back to sleep. And so I had a dream that I couldn't go out into my living room because I didn't know if they'd swept the zombies out. And I woke up and I was like, oh, that's a good idea for a book. After the apocalypse is over, how do you restart civilization? Someone has to sweep all the zombies out. And so I got an idea from a dream. Usually, if you wake up at 4 a.m., you have a dream, you write down the note, and you look up in the morning, and it's like, sex with my mother, that's not really
Thank you all for coming.
a novel. It's
Yeah.
more of a short story.
Well, it was a pretty good play back in the day, actually. Yeah.
So a dream, a newspaper article. Where do you
Very little involves sex with Mom. That's not what led me to George Bush. No, what I have a couple of tests. One is there a hole in the popular conversation about someone? Secondly, is there do I think that they have something to teach us? And third, is there a documentary hole? Is there some way I can add to the documentary record? So that's kind of a high dork way of doing it. David McCullough has a great line about you have to be in the spell of a book, that it comes when you're really thinking about it and those people are real to you. But it'll often come unbidden. I never know what I'm going to say until I'm saying it, until I'm actually writing. People say, somebody asked me last night, do you carefully outline? No. I do on the back end. I put myself in various mental health facilities with footnotes, and it's you laugh, but there have been the makers of Zoloft have made a lot of money off me, mainly because of footnotes. But I think it's, to my mind, what you have to be comfortable with is if you're going to spend, if you're not Bob Caro, who's now spent, I think he's now been doing Lyndon Johnson longer than Lyndon's been alive. But if you're going to spend 4 or 5 years with someone, I think you have to like them. And you don't have to love them, but you have to find that their company repays your attention.
I mean, I think, I do outline, and that sort of is a way to not get stuck halfway through a book. I'm like, actually, this was a really bad idea. I should not have started this book. Oh, yeah. And so if I know the ending, I know the beginning, and the middle can be fuzzy, I have sort of kicked the tires on this idea, and before I start writing, I've committed to it.
I have two self-policing tricks. One is if I can't write the introduction before I start, then I'm not ready. And then about halfway through, I always have that cataclysmic moment that this was a disaster. I really should have stuck with running a convenience store. And so I write the epilogue. which is functionally kind of the book talk. What I would try to tell you all about this if I'd done something, and that sort of resharpens everything, and will generally push me through.
No, I think knowing the end, for me, knowing the ending helps. I'm writing towards that ending.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
With me, it helps because usually they're dead.
Yeah, sure.
So now, in your world, apparently that's not a stopping point.
No, yes. Yeah.
But I can't have much. So what's next?
Another, it's too early to talk about it, but depressing story about America.
Well, now, let's unpack that a little bit, because, I mean, history is not necessarily depressing. I mean, what your novel is, the subject your novel is about was our great original sin. But so test whether you agree with this. But with the work of the Civil War, with ultimately the work of 100 years later, we have expanded the definition of what Jefferson was talking about. It's been too slow, it's been tragic, it's not complete, but our immigration issue in the country is that more people want to come here than to leave. So we're getting something right. Would you agree with that?
Sure. No, I mean, I didn't pick up the optimism part of what you're saying before. And I think I have to be optimistic. I have children, and I have to believe that they're growing up in a world that will be better. I don't think in the same way my grandparents and parents would hope that they're raising children in a better world than the one they were born into. Obviously, I think that people have been receptive to my book. It means that it's not the same world my grandparents and parents were born into. But then a lot of things have not changed. I do get asked about Cora and where she ends up, like what's next for her. Is she going to settle down and have a family, everything be great? And she escapes the plantation, but she's also stuck in 1850, and she could go to California, win the lottery, become a millionaire, have a nice family, but she's still a black woman in a racist country. And so and that's the only sort of happy ending she can have is being away from the plantation, because the North's a bit better, California's a bit better, but there's a reality of American racism. So I'm trying to understand America in different books. Sometimes I'm trying to figure out myself. My book about growing up, my zombie books, why do I like zombies? What can I, in doing the research as a semi-grown up and studying slavery, what story can I extract about my hopes and dreams for my country? And so I say depressing book because it is terrible to read about things we do to each other. And day to day, putting a character through these different situations, whether it's slavery or what I'm writing about now, I think does take a toll. Where do we end up at the end of the story, a novel? Is our protagonist in a place of refuge? Has he or she escaped the societal constraints that he or she's been born into? What do I want to say to the reader? How do I feel about things myself? And so there's my own personal optimism about the world, and there's what is true to the story, and what's a real denouement for a slave running away, what's true to the reality of the characters' lives that you choose to take on.
Is the Civil War over?
Civil War's over. Do we get along? No. Do we get along better than we did 150 years ago? Sure. Are black people being lynched? No. Are we being shot if we're in the wrong car, in the wrong neighborhood, if we're walking down the wrong street at the wrong time, in the wrong state? Yeah. Are there places where, I guess the book came out, people are like, have you thought about the reception in the South where slavery happened? And I was like, New York had slavery too. And my book's been really well received in some parts of the South, say North Carolina. I've been there 6 times in the last year and a half. I haven't been to Alabama. Which places are really interested in engaging with the book and their own state's history and which places aren't. And so that's been sort of interesting for me to see where people engage with the book and where they don't. Civil War over. Do we have a long way to go? Unfortunately, yeah.
As a Tennessean, we often say, thank God for Alabama, never more so than last fall. So you're probably fine not going. Well, Colson, thank you. There was a wonderful letter, I'm not sure it's been published, from Robert Penn Warren wrote on the occasion of Alan Tate's 75th birthday. And he wrote that ideally poetry, artistic fiction, is redemption from the accident, error, and evils of life and of our lives. And I think that Colson is doing exactly that in his work. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.